Before the bombs, before the uniforms, before World War II officially began, Britain made a promise, and breaking it would shape decades of conflict. In 1917, Britain was still fighting a war it could barely afford. Men were dying in trenches. Empires were shaking. The future was uncertain. So Britain wrote promises. Not one, several. One was sent to Arab leaders, encouraging revolt against the Ottoman Empire. Another was sent to Europe's Zionist leadership. This one was addressed to Lord Walter Rothschild. It spoke of support, of sympathy, of a future national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. The words were careful, almost gentle. They avoided borders. They avoided numbers. They avoided consequences. But they carried weight. Because Britain did not own Palestine, and yet, it promised it anyway. At the time, Palestine was not empty. Arab families lived there, farmed there, buried their dead there. They were not asked. They were not mentioned. The letter moved forward without them. When World War I ended, the Ottoman Empire collapsed. Palestine fell under British control, not by consent, but by mandate. Now, the promise had teeth. British officials arrived with maps and authority. Immigration policies were written. Decisions were enforced. Jewish migration increased. Arab anxiety grew. Both sides pointed to Britain. Both believed Britain had promised them something. But Britain had promised too much. Protests followed, then riots, then crackdowns. British soldiers stood between two communities that no longer trusted each other. Each year, the situation worsened. Britain delayed decisions, issued reports, formed commissions, but never fixed the contradiction at the center of it all. Europe, meanwhile, was sliding toward another war, and the promise once bold, once useful, was becoming dangerous. By the late 1930s, Britain began to step back. The words remained. The commitment did not. Immigration was restricted. Hope was rationed. The people caught in between had nowhere to go. The promise still existed on paper, but in practice, it was already breaking. By the time World War II began, Britain no longer knew what to do with its own words. The promise had brought pressure, violence, responsibility, and Britain was tired. As Nazi persecution intensified in Europe, Jewish refugees looked toward Palestine. The promise still echoed, but the gates were narrowing. British policy shifted, limits were imposed, ships were turned away, some never reached shore. At the same time, Arab resistance hardened. They saw the promise as betrayal, proof that decisions about their land were being made elsewhere. Britain tried to hold control with force. It failed. The mandate became ungovernable. Every attempt to balance the promise angered both sides. Every delay deepened the divide. Then came the war. World War II consumed Britain's attention, its resources, its patience. Palestine became a problem postponed. When the war ended, Britain no longer wanted the burden. Exhausted and weakened, it stepped away, not by resolving the promise, but by handing it off. The question of Palestine was passed to the United Nations. Partition was proposed. War followed. Britain left. The promise it had made was never fully honored, and never fully undone. What began as a diplomatic letter became a permanent conflict, not because it existed, but because it was broken halfway. The people who lived there paid the price. Generation after generation, Britain moved on. The consequences stayed. Promises, once written, do not disappear. They wait, and sometimes they become history. Britain did not stay to see what followed. By 1948, the mandate was over. British flags were lowered. Officials packed files, maps, and reports. They left behind a decision that was never finished. The land did not pause when Britain withdrew. It reacted. Partition lines were announced. They were drawn on paper, not on lived reality. Villages found themselves on the wrong side of borders overnight. Families fled before they understood why. Some believed it would be temporary. It wasn't. War followed immediately. Not a world war this time. A local one, fought street by street, village by village. The promise had fractured into claims. Each side pointed backward, not forward. One side remembered the letter, the other remembered the silence. Refugees moved with what they could carry. Some locked doors, expecting to return. Many never did. New states were declared. New armies formed. Old grievances hardened. Britain issued statements from afar. Regret without repair. Distance without responsibility. The promise was now history. Quoted, debated, defended, denied. But history did not absorb the damage. It passed it on. Children grew up inside its consequences. Borders became checkpoints. Memory became inheritance. Decades later, the language remained polite, diplomatic, careful, but the wound stayed open. What Britain had written in a moment of strategy had outlived its authors. It outlived the war it was meant to influence. It outlived the empire that issued it. The promise was never erased, only abandoned. And abandoned promises do not fade. They settle into the ground, into families, into generations who had no part in making them. Britain moved on to rebuilding. The world moved on to other crises. But the letter stayed, still cited, still argued, still shaping lives. Not because it was powerful, but because it was unfinished. After Britain withdrew in May 1948, the mandate formally ended. On the same day, the State of Israel was declared. Within hours, armed forces from neighboring Arab states entered the former mandate territory. Egypt, Transjordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq moved troops across the borders. Fighting spread rapidly. Former British-controlled areas became active fronts. Roads, towns, and supply routes changed hands repeatedly. By early 1949, armistice agreements were signed. No final borders were established. Instead, ceasefire lines were drawn. They became known as the Green Line. Israel controlled more territory than had been allocated under the Unpartition Plan. The West Bank came under Jordanian control. The Gaza Strip came under Egyptian administration. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinian Arabs were displaced during the fighting. Many crossed into neighboring territories. Others remained within new borders under military administration. No comprehensive refugee settlement was reached. In the following years, immigration to Israel increased, including large numbers of Holocaust survivors and Jewish populations from Middle Eastern and North African countries. Border incidents continued throughout the 1950s. Armistice lines were crossed. Retaliatory operations followed. In 1956, Israel, Britain, and France launched a military operation against Egypt following the nationalization of the Suez Canal. The campaign ended under international pressure. In 1967, war broke out again. Israel captured the West Bank, East Jerusalem, Gaza Strip, Sinai Peninsula, and Golan Heights. Military occupation was established in the newly captured territories. In 1973, Egypt and Syria launched a coordinated attack to regain lost territory. Fighting ended with disengagement agreements. In 1979, Egypt and Israel signed a peace treaty. The Sinai Peninsula was returned to Egypt. The West Bank and Gaza remained under Israeli control. In 1987, a mass uprising began in the occupied territories. It lasted several years. Negotiations followed in the early 1990s. Limited self-governing authorities were established in parts of the West Bank and Gaza. Final status issues remained unresolved. Subsequent conflicts, negotiations, and ceasefires occurred without a comprehensive settlement. The documents written before World War II continued to be cited in diplomatic and legal arguments. The territorial and political outcomes established after Britain's withdrawal remained in place, with modifications, but without final resolution.